This is from Fred Beck's book. And this is Fred Beck's own account in his own words. So when I'm reading, I'm reading from Fred Beck's account. So here we go. First of all, I wish to give an account of the attack and tell the famous incident of July 1924 when the hairy apes attacked our cabin. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the Mount St. Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had from time to time come across large tracks by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claims at Vander White. It was 2 miles east of the Mount St. Helens near a deep canyon now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after an account of the incident reached the newspapers. Hank, a great hunter and good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks. The tracks were large and we knew that no known animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches long. It was in the middle of July and we had received a good assay on our claim, and everyone was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he take me to town to see a dentist, but he was so enthused in the prospects of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not keep him away from that. We had all come up in his Ford, and I had no way to get to town unless he took me. So when we went back to our cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hotcakes. Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge and then hear an answering whistle from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on its chest. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring about 100 yards from our cabin to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away on the other side of a little canyon, standing by a tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree, and at the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that was quite a distance to see the bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party, and we all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning, as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves and had made it very sturdy. It stood for years afterward and was visited by many sightseers until a few years ago when it was burned to the ground. The circumstances of the fire I do not recall. In the cabin we had a long bunk bed in which 2 could sleep, feet to feet. The rest of us sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin. So darkness found all of us in the cabin more calm now, and my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around puffing on pipes and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcome bed and soon fell asleep. About midnight we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking. But the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from between the logs, and it had fell across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, my gun being a .30-30 Winchester, which I still have. I helped to get the chinking off of him, and he jumped to his feet. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shapes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual count, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. This was the start of the famous attack, of which so much has been written in Washington and Oregon newspapers throughout the years. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin, and say some even fell through the roof, but this was not quite the case. There were very few large rocks in that area. It is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof. They hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. Some accounts state I was hit in the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is not true. The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were shooting only when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking had we chosen to shoot. We did not shoot, however. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, but this was pretty much an impossibility. As previously stated, the cabin was a sturdy made building. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. One had a pistol, which is still in my family's possession. The others clutched their rifles. They seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night with only short intervals between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. A much written about incident, and a true one. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright so that it caught on the logs, and at the same time Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go, and I pulled the handle back in and put the axe in a safe place. A humorous thing I well remember was Hank singing, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious and sang under the impression that the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we cautiously came out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away on the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times, and it toppled over the cliff down into the gorge some 400 feet below. Then Hank said we should get out of there as soon as possible and not bother to pack our supplies or equipment out. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than our lives. We were only too glad to agree. We brought out only that which we could get into our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the happenings to anyone, and they agreed. But Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went into the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." That was just what Hank did, to the puzzlement of the ranger. When we were back home in Kelso, Washington, he told some of his friends, and somehow the story leaked out to the papers. And the great hairy ape hunt of 1924 was on. Local reporters interviewed us. They came from Portland and Seattle. Even a big game hunter from England came asking questions, and he had a large gun with him that must have been made to hunt elephants with. Many people flocked to the Mount St. Helens area looking for the great hairy apes or mountain devils. I myself went back with 2 reporters and a detective from Portland, Oregon. We found large tracks and they photographed them. The detective measured the tracks at 19 inches. We do not see any of the 8 men then, nor did we find the ones we had shot. So people were asking questions. Was it true or was it just a wild tale? I can assure you it is true. Are they human, animal, or devils? I will answer that question in this book. That was a great ape hunt in 1924. In the last few years, more and more people have reported seeing them. There is an ape hunt being revived again, and another man has written a book on the subject and has formed a club whose purpose is to find evidence to prove what they already believe, that abominable snowmen of America do exist.
Yeah, that's certainly a lot different than the story that I grew up hearing, because I heard that they were throwing boulders on the cabin and trying to get in through windows and everything. So yeah, I mean, this is an account directly from Fred Beck, that he dictated that to his son in 1967. Now, what I have that comes out of On the Track of the Sasquatch by John Green is Rogers Patterson's interview with Fred Beck a year before this, in 1966. And he goes on to say, "We was mining in there, working our claims, about 2 years before we had contact with them. We seen tracks down by the muddy. We didn't know what they were. Thought probably some big Indian in there fishing barefooted. But we heard rumors. People been up in there years before telling the same thing too. Seen them big tracks up in there. One fellow was telling about fishing. He had a string of fish and laid them on the bank. And when he went to get this, looked around and there was a great big man, like great big hairy fella. Had his fingers and was just smashed them along the rocks, and he came out of there faster than he went in, and nobody believed him. But mind you, my father-in-law, who we now know is probably Hank, was there with me, and he believed him. He said that fella doesn't lie because he knew him. He said that fella was scared when he come out of there because it wasn't no human. Then we seen them tracks there. We never thought too much about it. My father-in-law was telling us about these people he knew, his experiences years ago, seeing them tracks up in there. One thing led to another. And the Indians, there was a lot of Indians around here in them days. Them old Indians was afraid to go back up in there to Spirit Lake because they was afraid of all the spirits. When he went up in there, he never explained or never accepted anything like that. We heard noises there, whistling noises like pounding on their chests. And Patterson asks, when was the first time you actually seen one? Beck answers, well, it was about 2 years after that we were seeing them. There was a spring a little ways from our mining cabin. We had to go down into a gully to get water, and there's a ridge. The old man always carried his rifle with him when he went into that spring because he had seen them tracks, awful suspicious tracks. He always carried his rifle. He went down, I went with him, went down to get some water, and we looked up on the ridge, and there, about 100 yards away, we seen this one peeking out of this tree. And I seen him first and said, Marion, look over by that tree. He looked there and he jumped up, and bang, 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 I see the bark fly, and the bullets were all just in place, just like that, right around the bark of the tree, just, Patterson replies, yeah. So, and Beck goes on to say, we seen him running down the ridge then, and he took a couple more shots at him. Marion then, he shot first. I rushed over there. It was hard going, he said. Don't run, don't run. Frank, don't run, he said. Don't go far, he said. I put 3 shots in that fool, and he won't go far. So we got up to the ridge and looked down, and there he was going, just going. Looked like it'd be 12, 14 feet, just jumping and running. The old man took a couple more shots at him, and the old man said, my God, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. How can that fella just get away with them slugs in his head, he said. I hit him. Well, he got away all right. Then Patterson asks, well, now the tracks that you've seen before, you would estimate it around how big? And Beck replies, well, say 19 inches they measured. You see, the 2 detectives up with us from Portland, they measured the tracks. It rained that night. We stayed at the lake for regular cloudbursts. We went up there and we had, there was washed out ditches right under the little sheep hole. You know, springs that they might call them, springs, melted snow, kind of a little gully there. We had cleaned out our pots, our beans and rice. It quit raining before we got there. When we went up there were tracks made since it rained, fresh tracks about 19 inches long. And the detective said, well, these are tracks all right, but he said, who made them? I said, well, who did make them? I said. We was all together, and they've been made since the rain. And they talked about it, and they